In our previous section, we left off on a sort of cliffhanger as to what had been going on since the productivity explosion of the Green Revolution had started to level off in the 1990s. And we had mentioned that one dimension of the Green Revolution was the selective breeding of important crop plants for more desirable, higher yield varieties. So, selective breeding is the process of selecting two organisms with desirable traits to breed together and produce offspring that then inherit those desirable traits. And what this means in practice is basically that farmers survey their populations of crops, maybe observe that a few individual corn plants produce larger cobs than all of the others, and take those plants and manually cross pollinate them so that that larger cob trait would become genetically entrenched in the lineage for that crop variety. And while this was a key component of the Green Revolution, the process of selective breeding has actually been going on far before the Green Revolution began. It's been going on for thousands of years. And it has resulted in some pretty dramatic improvements in what we would recognize as food. Um, so, before selective breeding, natural corn that existed in the year 7000 BC, which was native to Central America, was less than 2 centimeters long. You would have to peel it by hammering it repeatedly with a hard object, only to yield 5 to 10 very hard kernels that would taste like a very dry raw potato. So today, thanks to selective breeding, a corn cob on the right that you can see in this image is 10 times the size of quote unquote natural corn with hundreds of kernels. It's easily peeled, easily cooked, easily eaten, and we can thank selective breeding for that. Similarly, take a natural peach as it existed in 4000 BC, native to East Asia. Peaches were about an inch in diameter. They had a waxy skin. The pit made up over a third of the volume of the fruit, and the fruit itself tasted earthy, sweet, sour, and slightly salty. On the right, peaches today, of course, are much, much larger. The volume is 64 times greater than their ancestral fruit. The pit only accounts for 10% of the fruit, and the fruit has a softer skin, it's sweeter, and has a higher sugar content. So, again, a much more pleasant and nutritional eating experience brought to you by selective breeding. We can think about these products of selective breeding as being a type of genetically modified organism, or GMO. So, GMO is an abbreviation you might have heard before. There tends to be a lot of media coverage and attention given to GMOs. And there's also a lot of misinformation and information that isn't scientifically supported. So, here in this class, we're interested only in the facts. We're interested in what a GMO is, how they are created, what their benefits are, and what their drawbacks are. So, a GMO, genetically modified organism, is simply an organism whose DNA has been genetically altered. Selective breeding was the ancient original process for genetically modifying organisms, a slow, painstaking process of people identifying which naturally occurring mutations should be preserved in the lineage of a plant for the benefit of humans, and then shepherding those plants through their evolution over thousands of generations. But thousands of generations is a long time. And so in the mid 1980s, when those rapid improvements in agricultural productivity that had been brought about by the early Green Revolution started to taper off, a new approach was needed. So agricultural scientists began to turn to genetic engineering to accomplish what selective breeding had been doing, but in a much more rapid and direct way. So with genetic engineering, instead of waiting around for beneficial mutations to occur in the crops at random and then choosing those mutants to crossbreed with each other, the genetic alterations are made directly to the plant's DNA. And almost always, this involves identifying a gene for a desirable trait in another plant or organism, then copying it and transferring it into the DNA of the crop plant that you're working with. And I'll give you a specific example. So, golden rice. Golden rice is a GMO that was created with the goal of producing a more vitamin rich variety of rice. So, you probably know that rice is a staple food in many parts of the world, in the Middle East, in many parts of Africa, Asia, Southeast Asia, and South and Central America, all of these regions consume a lot of rice. And it also happens to be the case that in many of the countries in these parts of the world, populations are affected by a serious vitamin A deficiency. So in this map, what you see is the rates of vitamin A deficiency by country, where green indicates an average healthy level of vitamin A, and then going down through light green, yellow, orange, red means clinically deficient in vitamin A, meaning it's actually considered a medical condition how low the vitamin A levels are. And being deficient in vitamin A is a major issue because vitamin A is very important to eyesight and the development of the eye. So, vitamin A deficiency leads to clouding of the cornea. It causes night blindness, corneal scarring, and when it's clinically severe enough, it causes permanent blindness. And children who are vitamin A deficient are also more likely to die from diseases like measles and diarrheal illnesses that lead to severe dehydration. So, needless to say, vitamin A deficiency, a serious health issue that a huge swath of the world is severely affected by. So, where does golden rice come into the picture here? Well, golden rice is a variety of rice that has been genetically modified to include two new genes that allow the rice plant to produce something called beta carotene. Beta carotene, you may have heard of before. It is a nutrient that humans must get in their diet in order to be able to produce vitamin A. It's the precursor for vitamin A. And beta carotene is found naturally in carrots, sweet potatoes, certain types of squash, and other vegetables and plants and flowers. And as you may suspect from this list, beta carotene has a yellow orange color. And this is evident in the visual comparison that you see between the golden rice on the left in this photo and the non GMO rice on the right. So, in the case of golden rice, scientists actually copied the gene for beta carotene out of the daffodil plant, the flower, which also produces beta carotene as a pigment for its flowers. And the hope is that golden rice can be adopted in many of these countries that are plagued by vitamin A deficiency and where rice is already a dietary staple. So, this GMO was developed back in the year 2000, and since then it has been undergoing testing for safety and nutritional standards. And in 2018, it was approved in both Canada and the United States. In 2019, it was approved in the Philippines, but then in 2023, the country's Supreme Court ordered that the cultivation of golden rice must be stopped after a petition was filed by citizens in the Philippines who believe that golden rice poses a health risk to people. But in reality, it's just the opposite. Golden rice could improve health, and the genetic modifications that have been included in this GMO are so minute. The genes come from known organisms, and there are well over 30,000 genes in the DNA of rice. And only two out of those 30,000 genes were substituted for genes from other known organisms to create golden rice. Otherwise, golden rice is genetically identical to normal rice. There's no evidence in any health and safety trial that it has any effect other than improving beta carotene intake. Nonetheless, this idea that changing an organism's DNA somehow inherently generates health risks is a powerful one that has gripped the media in many countries, including here in the United States. We also do want to take a nuanced approach to understanding GMOs, though, and realize that not all GMOs are the same and not all carry the same risks and benefits. So, we've looked at golden rice as an example of a GMO. This is an appropriate time to turn our discussion to the most widely planted and controversial GMO in the United States, which is the Roundup Ready product line created by the agricultural giant Monsanto. So this isn't just one GMO that we're talking about, but a series of GMO crops that all have the same genetic modification. The product line includes corn, soybeans, alfalfa, canola, cotton, and sugar beets. And Roundup Ready wheat is currently under development, but not yet on the market. And the adoption of these crop varieties is pretty ubiquitous in the United States. Presently, over 90% of all of the corn, soybeans, canola, sugar beets, and cotton grown in the US comes from the Roundup Ready product line. And alfalfa was introduced more recently, so its numbers are lower, but they are increasing. So, why are these crops so popular? What benefit do they carry? So, the genetic modification that has been put in place in all of these plants is resistance to a weed killer called Roundup. Roundup is a product that you can buy. You may have seen it on shelves in the hardware store. The active ingredient in Roundup is a chemical called glyphosate. And the way that glyphosate works is that when you spray it on a plant, the glyphosate chemical enters the plant cells and disables a very important enzyme called EPSP synthase. Without this enzyme, plants can't produce proteins and therefore they can't survive. So this is how glyphosate kills the plant. Okay, so how did Monsanto make these crops resistant to Roundup? They discovered that there is a group of bacteria called agrobacteria that also have this EPSP synthase enzyme in their cells. The version that you see in bacteria is almost identical to the version seen in plants, but the version of the enzyme found in these bacteria is not susceptible to Roundup. It's naturally resistant. So glyphosate has no effect on it. So the gene for that enzyme was copied from the agrobacteria, then used to replace the gene for the enzyme in each of the crop plants in the product line. And then the final GMO product is also resistant to glyphosate. And this means when you're growing a field of Roundup Ready sugar beets, for example, and weeds start to appear in the field amongst your sugar beets, you can spray the whole field with Roundup and it will kill the weeds, but it will leave the sugar beets unaffected. That's the value of Roundup Ready crops. So now that we understand the science of how these crops were engineered, we have to ask the question, are they safe? What are the benefits? What are the consequences? So to answer this first question, yes, they are safe. There was only one very small genetic modification made to these crop plants. And that genetic modification, the replacement of the plant's gene for EPSP synthase with the agrobacteria gene for EPSP synthase, it's a very small change and it's completely harmless. The crops are otherwise genetically identical to non GMO crops. So the plants themselves are really no different. But there's a separate question. What about the weed killer Roundup? Because the question of whether the plant itself is safe to eat is different from the question of whether the weed killer being used on the plant is also safe. So the health effects of glyphosate have been studied by numerous agencies for many years that are looking to see whether it's safe for people to ingest. Because, of course, if it is being sprayed on crops, some of it is going to make its way into your foods. So how safe is it to ingest? The EPA has performed animal studies to answer this question, and from those studies has repeatedly shown that glyphosate has a very low toxicity when it's ingested. There was one notable study wherein mice were exposed to glyphosate over the course of 2 years at a dose of 750 milligrams of glyphosate per kilogram of their body weight per day, and researchers found that there was no increase in cancer among the mice. And it's important to realize that this is a massive amount of glyphosate that the mice were being exposed to. So the equivalent for a human who weighs 150 pounds, that would be like eating zero point 0.1 pounds of pure glyphosate every day for 2 years, which is a very implausible amount. And this is not the only study that has shown that the ingestion of glyphosate is safe. There are many others, but the result of this one is quite striking. And it's also important to realize at the same time that animal trials are not the same as human trials. And also that cancer is not the only health outcome that we should be concerned about. And also that ingesting the glyphosate is not the only way that people can be exposed to it. For example, farmers can be exposed to it through inhalation if they spray it on their crops. But these studies do give us a good picture of what the risks associated with glyphosate are, and they appear to be low for ingestion as the route of consumption. And importantly, the toxicity of glyphosate is much lower compared to other herbicides that used to be more far widely used. And Now, glyphosate has replaced a lot of those more harmful herbicides as Roundup Ready crops have become more widely adopted. So, this includes herbicides like atrazine, which is a known endocrine disruptor and possibly a teratogen, a cause of birth defects, and alachlor, which is a carcinogen and causes liver, kidney, and spleen damage. So, substituting glyphosate for these older generation herbicides is actually a positive thing because we know that glyphosate is not as bad as these other chemicals. In addition, if you can spray to get rid of your weeds, then that means that you don't have to till the soil to do away with them. And that reduces rates of erosion. There has actually been an over time downward trend in the soil erosion rates in the United States, which is not exclusively attributable to less tilling due to GMO use, but it's certainly one factor. And then finally, without the competition for space and resources that is posed by weeds growing in your cropland, Roundup Ready crops produce a higher yield, which leads to more abundant food and cheaper prices for that food. But of course, as I said before, we want to be nuanced in our examination of Roundup Ready crops. And so it's also important to talk about the negative consequences of their widespread adoption. And one of these consequences is a huge increase in the number of species of weeds that are resistant to glyphosate. The number of species of weeds on which Roundup no longer works has jumped by hundreds of percent in parts of the world that have adopted the Roundup Ready product line, some of which you can see here. United States, Australia, Argentina, Brazil, and Canada are all represented on this graph. So essentially, by using Roundup so widely and extensively, we are causing weeds to evolve adaptations that allow them to survive in the face of glyphosate exposure. You can see the number of species of weeds that have these beneficial adaptations for themselves to survive in the face of glyphosate going up and up and up over time. And if these trends continue, then we'll be in a bind with our dependence on Roundup Ready products and an herbicide that's no longer doing the trick. We'll talk more about the issue of superweeds in our next section. But before we get there, there is another common GMO crop line that we need to talk about as well, and that is BT crops. So, whereas Roundup Ready crops have been genetically modified so that they are resistant to the herbicide Roundup, BT crops have been genetically modified to produce their own insecticides. They've been given the genes for creating insecticidal proteins that kill the insect pests that try to eat these crops. So, in the case of Roundup Ready crops, the new beneficial gene for glyphosate resistance was transferred over from agrobacteria. In the case of BT crops, the genes for insecticidal proteins were also transferred from a species of bacteria, and this one is called Bacillus thuringiensis, or BT for short. And this species of bacteria is one that infects moths and butterflies. It's a pathogen for moths and butterflies. So it naturally produces these proteins that are toxic to moths and butterflies and other insects in order to facilitate its own life cycle. It's part of what it does. However, these proteins while they're harmful to insects, they are harmless to humans and safe for us to consume. And a big reason why is because the proteins have to be activated by a basic pH, in other words, an alkaline pH environment. And the stomachs of insects have a basic alkaline pH. But as you probably know, the human stomach has a very acidic pH. So without the alkaline pH, the proteins lack any toxic effect. And furthermore, the proteins are only absorbed by receptors that are specific to the insect stomach. These receptors are not found in humans. The proteins create pores that perforate the lining of the insect stomach and ultimately kill it. And that prevents the pest from eating the crop. So, because of these benefits, BT crops have become widely adopted, just like Roundup Ready crops have. Corn and cotton are the most common in the United States, and both now account for over 80% of the corn and 80% of the cotton grown in our country. BT soybeans and BT eggplants have also been developed, but they are primarily grown in other countries. What you can see in this figure here is rates of adoption of genetically engineered crops in the United States, where HT, if you see HT in front of the name of a crop, that means herbicide tolerant, so essentially Roundup Ready. And then BT is the ones that produce their own insecticide. Both of them have been adopted with a lot of enthusiasm and are very widely used today. And just as has been the case with Roundup Ready crops and their herbicide resistant weeds that they're generating, so too have insects been gaining resistance to BT over time. So the line in black here shows the number of millions of hectares of BT crops planted over time in the United States. And the red bars show the number of insect species that have become resistant to BT over time in the same period. And you can see there is a strong correlation between the two. So again, the pests are evolving adaptations to these innovations that we've been using against them. So BT and Roundup Ready crops are the most popular GMOs that have been developed so far, but the research into potential genetic modifications for further improving agricultural productivity is continuing. One area of focus for future improvements is drought tolerance. So, as climate change takes hold, temperatures rise, rain patterns change. And in this map, you can see how drought conditions are already negatively affecting agricultural yield in farmland across America. The color coding is in red. Yield loss over 80 bushels due to drought. You can see that some areas loss of yield to drought is quite severe because agriculture is the single largest source of fresh water consumption globally. And so if crops have less access to rainwater and they need more irrigation water, that also poses a serious strain on our freshwater resources. And so, if important crop plants could be equipped with genetic modifications that make them better able to tolerate low water conditions, this would be a huge benefit in our changing climate affected world. Additional targets for future improvements include delayed ripening of fruits and vegetables, which makes it easier to transport them. Also, enhanced nutritional content, as in the case of golden rice, for example, and really any modifications that lead to an even higher yield as our worldwide population is continuing to grow, and that is continuing to put strain on food production.